Hello, welcome to our presentation. I'm going to be looking at material that's largely taken from Chapter 1 in your textbook, the textbook by Konenberger and Briggs, and I'll be getting you some updates on your textbook. I understand some of you have ordered and have that in hand now, which is good to hear. Okay, so what are the themes in this first chapter? Well, the big theme is the fall of the Roman Empire. The ancient world is passing away in these centuries between about 400 and 800 CE. And in its place, we have the emergence of the medieval age or the medieval age, and this period that some people have pretty much mistakenly known as the Dark Ages. It's this in-between time. But what is the legacy of the Roman Empire? Well, keep in mind as well, that's why the medieval period is so important, because it's that time of the medieval era can be either the time where a lot of Roman traditions end, the empire itself passes away. The empire in the West is no longer able to collect taxes and to fund itself. But it's that medieval era that is the conduit, the link between the later era and our era in the modern world and the ancients. So that's why they're all so important. We have the linguistic legacy of the Roman Empire. The Romance language is even in our own language, much of which is based on Latin words, which are Roman words. There are other aspects of the Roman Empire that continue today as well. Our alphabet, our numbering systems, all these things. Certainly, the legacy of Christianity and the church. The way in which the Roman Empire broke up and then formed into these larger, smaller feudal states, and sometimes very small, what would become later fiefdoms or baronries, right? That you're reading about this week in Life in a Medieval Baronry. Okay, so you have some interesting quotes in this chapter, such as the medieval mind was haunted by the ruins of the Roman Empire. Now, why would he say that? They're really haunted by them. Well, it's interesting because I think they were, in a sense, even shortly after the Roman Empire in the West falls prey to the Germanic tribes such as the Visigoths, the Vandals, and then the final huge force that comes in and kind of puts the end to the Roman Empire in the West are the Huns, and those of Attila the Hun. That's certainly the main textbook reason for the fall of the Roman Empire, but that's more of a symptom of other problems that were weakening and had been weakening the Roman Empire for centuries. And the other misnomer, the other thing that we misconstrue about the Roman Empire is that the Roman Empire fell completely. It did not. The Roman Empire continues in the East. It splits into two parts. It had split long before its fall. After its conversion to Christianity, it was thought easier to administer for administration purposes to have an Eastern capital and a Western capital. So Constantinople, after the Emperor Constantine, becomes the capital in the East, and Rome, of course, in the boot of Italy in the West. One thing that is lost when the Roman Empire in the West falls is what was thought to be that divine link between the emperor and the people. And this is where you have the entry into the non-Christian nomadic German tribes that began assaulting the Roman Empire and even began their attacks on Rome periodically, beginning in about 410 CE. What are some of the other causes of the fall of the empire? Well, it's true that they had, like lots of bureaucracies, they had this tendency to grow their administration, their military, and costs for their infrastructure made taxes quite high. It's estimated, I think you see in your textbook there, that somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of agriculture output often went to taxes. Still, the textbook points out that civilization, even in the West, does not end with the fall of the Roman Empire. And a lot of these large estates held by sometimes Roman citizens and then maybe new Germanic tribesmen, these new estates would also slowly transform into the kind of life and lifestyle and culture that you see depicted in life in a medieval city, a medieval baronry. So keep that in mind as well. There still is a lot of luxurious living in the 500s and into the 600s. The breaking point here were these barbarian invasions, and I use this term, because that's the term that they used. It referred, I believe, I mentioned this in the other lecture, to those who did not speak Latin. Those who made the ba 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 sound by nonsensical sounds, and so they're the people who spoke gibberish. So they called them barbarian, which also meant outsider or uncivilized. Another thing the Romans did is they had often almost encouraged intertribal fighting of their enemies, because it was easy to keep at bay your enemies if they were divided. And really, by the end of the 400s, of the 5th century, it is the invasion into Western Europe by the Huns that really transformed things. And the Huns were true nomads. Some of these Germanic tribes were not actual true nomads, meaning following the seasons on horseback, moving to different locales frequently throughout the year, no sedentary lifestyle. The Huns really were true nomads. And what they tended to do was push these other nomadic tribes in front of them. They sort of fled in front of them, and cause even more chaos amongst these tribes. And it's the horseman skills of the Huns, their composite bow, which combined, mobility. They could shoot from horseback. They had firepower, and they were savage warriors. This was the strengths militarily of the Huns, led of course by Attila the Hun, the most famous of the Hun horsemen and leaders. By your textbook says that by the year 410 CE, there was lots of morale problem within the Roman Empire in loyalty. Why be loyal to a distant emperor who's drawing huge amounts of taxes from you when the emperor can't even defend you from these marauding horsemen? And the Huns formed a federation of tribes. Your textbook talks about how they blackmail the government in Constantinople to sort of not defend the West. Remember, there's this East and West divide in the Roman Empire. The East never really falls, at least not until much later, till 1453, by the Ottoman Empire. That's at the end of the Middle Ages. Certainly, this Battle of Catalonian Fields, that's Catalaunian, Catalonian Fields, in present-day France, was some kind of a turning point. But it's often been depicted later on as a defense that defeated a defense of the Western civilization and kind of the remnants of what was left of Rome from the barbarians of the East. But this is probably a bit too simplistic of a reading. What it probably allowed, though, was that the Romans were in fact weakened quite substantially by this battle, even though there might have been some victories, and allowed these other tribes, the Franks and the Burgundians, to move into this region in a kind of a power vacuum. So the Romans end up retreating from this part of the world too, but so do the Huns. It's kind of, both seem to have been greatly weakened by the great loss of life and probably trained soldiers there at Caledonian Field. Another myth that I thought was quite cleverly debunked by your textbook was that the horsemen from the east, the Huns coming in from the steppes of Asia and Central Asia, that they found natural harbor there in Western Europe, in the woods and forests. But actually, quite the opposite was true. The farther they pushed west, there tended to be less and less grazing land for their horses. So one of the reasons why the Huns have to retreat as well, not just military defeats and the robust fighting of what was left of the Roman Empire, or from these tribes that had aligned themselves with the Roman Empire, but because it was just the supplies lines were stretched, and it was difficult in the topography of the land there in Western Europe to feed their horses, especially when they came into larger urban areas. There's no feed for horses in these larger cities that they were laying waste all across Germany, what is today Germany, France, and Italy. So the Huns are pushing these German tribes in front of them, creating chaos as they move forward. And finally, in 476, the last of the Roman emperors is dethroned. 476. This is the end, really, of the Roman Empire in the West, not in the East, where it continues under Constantinople. And then in the final pages of this chapter in your textbook, it talks a little bit more about Constantinople, otherwise known as Byzantium, and the conflicts that Constantinople has in defending itself at this time against the Persian Empire, which it does defend itself, but from the warfare that comes out of it, the warfare between the Persian Empire, present-day Iran, right, and Constantinople, present-day Istanbul and Turkey, both countries are gravely weakened. Both empires are gravely weakened. And there is arising more and more a distinct cultural and religious difference between Western Christianity, or what will become known as the Roman Catholic Church, and Constantinople and the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church there. Some pretty serious theological differences and culture differences. Now, the one irony about all this all these barbaric tribes invading Western Europe um, is that the more successful they were, the more they had a tendency to settle down and stay, and in effect be swallowed up by the Germanic cultures that were there already, start speaking the local language, and adopt a more sedentary lifestyle. Right? They if they were victorious, they tended to give up their horse riding lifestyle and their warrior and nomadic lifestyle and become more sedentary. Um, Part of the other stress on the Roman Empire, as well has been pointed out by historians, was the immense number of slaves. Now, they weren't organized in kind of slave labor gangs like they would have been in the southern United States or in Caribbean countries. But nonetheless, these were slaves that were sometimes bought and sold. But there were certainly more face-to-face relations between slaves and non-slaves. And the other thing that evolves at this time is the development of these self-contained economic units. The idea, in other words, of the baronry or the fiefdom or the feudal estate. And also what develops at this time is the idea of loyalty. This is what is passed down from the Roman emperor, the power of the idea of an emperor and swearing loyalty to a distant emperor. Quick summation then, as Pax Romana began to fail. Now, Pax Romana, P-A-X R-O-M-A-N-A, means a Roman peace. The Roman peace, as it began to fail, in other words, as the Roman Empire is unable to defend itself from these invading Germanic tribes and from the Huns from Asia, they lose the loyalty of the important people in their empire. Why be loyal, as I said earlier in the presentation, to a distant emperor who can no longer protect you when you can sort of just make peace with the invading barbarian tribes? If you can't beat them, join them. And then for their part, the Germanic tribes, when they moved into some of these Roman Empire areas, they did the same thing. They settled down and stayed and were assimilated. All right, so that's kind of some of the themes we're looking at this week in your textbook. I'll have another presentation for you next week. 15 minutes in. Stop taking video.